When I was a young teenager, I used to spend my Saturday afternoons lying on the bed reading tragic tales by the Victorian novelist Thomas Hardy. In my late teens, it was Dickens and the Manchester novelist Elizabeth Gaskell, as well as the Bronte sisters. By the time I was in my early 20s, my best friend and I used to spend our Saturday nights, while everyone else was out partying, sitting on the floor with a bowl of lentil soup, a bottle of wine, reading out long 19th century poems to each other. I've always understood, engaged with, and sometimes escaped from the world through novels and poems. So when in 2014 my husband Richard died, aged 45, it was to books that I turned to help me find a narrative to make sense of this unbearable loss. And because I've spent large chunks of my life reading, writing about, and teaching Victorian literature, it was to the Victorians, above all, that I turned. This may seem surprising. What do we know about the Victorians, after all? They were buttoned up, covered up, messed up. They couldn't talk about sex, and they were obsessed with morbid ideas of death. Well, I'm not going to talk about sex, although I might note in passing that the wonderful socialist poet Edward Carpenter lived just outside Sheffield in Totley in the 1880s and 1890s as an openly gay man with his lover, with friends and visitors coming through, discussing sexuality, which Carpenter himself wrote treatises and books about, so not perhaps as repressed as we might think. But what about death? Was it all big funerals, formality, black clothes, all Queen Victoria laying out Albert's clothes day after day, year after year, obsessively? Or was it sensation? The poet Dante Gabriel Rossetti buried his poems with his wife Lizzie Siddal and then dug her up again a few years later to get them out. Or Sherlock Holmes writer Arthur Conan Doyle hosted, like many of his contemporaries, seances in his home in order to make contact with the dead. Well, these might be extreme examples of expressions of grief, but I want to suggest that, in fact, the Victorians understood death and dealt with bereavement much better in many ways than we do today, and that their writings show an intimate understanding of some of the processes of grief and grieving that have only recently been rediscovered in the psychology and sociology of grief. The Victorians understood the need for physical connections to the dead and physical expressions of internal grief. So they made rings and necklaces and brooches out of the hair of their dead loved ones, just as some organizations just recently now are starting to offer people the opportunity to make brooches or ornaments out of the ashes of their dead loved ones. They had set periods of mourning where family members and extending out to more distant relatives had to wear black. Not some kind of terrible adherence to rules and rituals, as that's often been presented, but a culturally sanctioned space of exemption from normal life and relationships, a recognition of the ongoing nature of grief and the need to express it externally. Not long after my husband died, I met a man I knew whose partner had also died. And this man had grown a great big dishevelled beard, what I came to call in my own mind a grief beard. I felt a visceral longing to grow such a beard myself, to have this vast physical expression of what was going on inside. It's a far cry from the stiff upper lip, that external visible sign of what's going on inside, and the Victorians understood that. But for me, what resonated most deeply with my own experience was Victorian literature. In the first few weeks after my husband died, I sent out to friends and I read and reread a poem by the Victorian Gerard Manley Hopkins, which begins, "No worst, there is none." And the poem goes on to talk about that feeling of falling off the edge of the world, which is the experience of early grief. Oh, the mind has mountains, cliffs of fall, frightful, sheer, no man fathomed. You can't imagine, in other words, that experience until you fall off the edge of that cliff. And after that, for the first time probably since I was a young child and learnt to read, I didn't read anything at all for a couple of weeks. Just a dreadful silence. And then I started to read everything I could get my hands on about grief. I wanted to find some kind of narrative that didn't say, "It's okay, you'll feel better soon." A narrative that didn't say, "It's all right, he's gone to a better place. That may be so, but it doesn't help me." A narrative that didn't say, as I'm sorry to tell you, the Victorian Henry Scott Holland wrote and has been quoted on many a funeral card, "Death is nothing at all." Death certainly was something. So I started to read novels and poems and memoirs from the Victorians and from our contemporaries. I started to read bereavement forums and online blogs. And eventually I started to read self-help books. And then I came to reading some psychological and sociological textbooks, really, about grief and the processes of grieving. And it was there that I came across the wonderful idea of continuing bonds. Continuing Bonds is the title of a book published, an academic study published in 1996. And it works against our dominant cultural Western idea of grief as a kind of time-limited process. So that in grieving you go up a spiral staircase and through a door eventually, and you close the door behind you, moving on or getting over it, which people hope you'll do. And actually, Continuing Bonds recognizes that what people who are grieving want is to have an ongoing connection with the person they've loved who has died. A way of remembering them in ritual and imagination and in the way they live their life. That people want to continue to hold on to something of the identity they had in relation to the dead person, even as they go out into the world and make their own new identity. So for me, I like the term widow, even though it conjures up a peculiarly Victorian idea of elderly women in black. But it's a continuing bond with the man I chose to marry. And nowhere in Victorian literature is this idea of continuing bonds more beautifully evoked than in Alfred Tennyson's long poem In Memoriam. It's a lament for his friend Arthur Hallam, who died aged 22 in 1833. The poem took 17 years to write, and it's full of Tennyson's memories of Hallam, extolling his character, remembering the times they had together. It's full of his own expressions of grief, and also his understanding of the world as he now knew it in the light of his loss. And Tennyson talks beautifully about that moment in early grief when you feel as though your own life is going to be at an end. And he describes that feeling that life will end. And he goes on saying, "It ends not, but endures with pain, and slowly forms the firmer mind, treasuring the look it cannot find, the words that are not heard again." That must be an experience of so many people who've grieved for somebody. The sense that you will never hear the words they spoke, the jokes they made, the things they said about the newspaper, the comments they passed to you in private. You'll never hear those words again. And for me also, the sense that that look of love that I saw for 21 years will never look at me again is a huge part of my loss. But at the same time, I treasure the look I cannot find. And it's a continuing bond, my memory of that look. So Tennyson explores very beautifully and very extensively, not with morbid obsession, I would argue, but with an utter commitment to the processes of grief, that absence and presence that runs through experiences of grief. And in the early days of grief, absence is the most terrible thing of all. And many of us ask questions in that early experience of absence. Where is the one who has died? Where is my beloved? And I want to suggest that when we ask that question, we're asking it in the way that my daughter used to ask when I left her at nursery and she didn't like it. Where's Mummy? And it didn't help her that the nursery staff would say, "Mummy's gone home and she'll be back in a few hours." She didn't want information about where I was. Really, that cry of "Where's Mummy?" meant, I want her here and I want her now. And really, that's what most of us mean when we're asking, where is the person who's died? And we might imagine that the Victorians, particularly religious as they were, would have had some pat answers about heaven to give to people asking those questions. But I want to just turn now to a much less well-known Victorian than Tennyson, and that's the wonderful socialist, feminist, anti-war writer Olive Schreiner, who was South African but spent large chunks of her adult life in Britain, and in fact in 1893 came to Sheffield and visited Edward Carpenter out at Millthorpe. And Olive Schreiner's most well-known book is called The Story of an African Farm. It tells the tale, among other things, of two children, a boy, Waldo, and a girl, Lyndall, who grew up together. The story follows their lives as they go out into the world. And it finishes, spoilers here, I'm afraid, just after the death of Lyndall, as a young woman. Waldo hears of her death, and he's stricken with grief. He's loved her from when he was a child. And as he tries to cope with his grief. He imagines the narratives that are available to him from his society. And he thinks particularly of the kind of prevailing idea that actually all is well with Lyndall now because she's an angel in heaven with God. And Waldo cries out, "I want no angel, only she, with all her sins upon her. So give her me, or give me nothing." And he goes on to think a little bit more about the way in which people would say, in some ways she's always with him because she's not in her body anymore, she's now only in spirit. And he cries out again, "Give me back what I have lost, or give me nothing." Waldo comes to his own understanding of what's happened to Lyndall, as all of us come to our own understanding of what's happened to those who've died, as I come to my own understanding as a person of faith. But I can think of few expressions more true, more honest, or more raw of the early sense of abandonment that comes with grief than those words that Olive Schreiner gives to Waldo. Any comfort offered at that stage is no comfort at all. We've got lots of cultural legacies from the Victorians, not least the rampant individualist capitalism that runs most of our society, as well as Marxism and well-developed anarchism and good drains and public museums and organised anti-war protest. All those are legacies from the Victorians, but we might want to revisit their incredibly emotionally intelligent understandings of grief. And I'm going to give the last word to Alfred Tennyson and In Memoriam. Tennyson explores the way in which those who die become strange to us, gone forever and no longer part of our everyday world. And yet at the same time, through that continuing bond that he expresses in his poetry and others of us express in different ways, they are in some way with us as we make our way in the world. Strange friend, past, present, and to be. Loved deeplier, darklier understood. Behold, I dream a dream of good, and mingle all the world with thee.